It is a great honor to be back with you. And Craig, thank you for embarrassing me with the tennis bit. It's embarrassing actually to play the way I do. It looks terrible. And Greg, thank you for the Matthew McConaughey book and donation and almost nailed the accent, I think. All right, all right, all right. So I want to share with you what we do as an organization. My guess is many of you don't really know a whole lot about the Committee of 100 and what it does, and much of that is on purpose. The organization really likes to stay behind the scenes and has done so since it was really created by a call from Edwin Edwards to some Baton Rouge business leaders in the early 1990s to really call into action some of the top executives of Louisiana. And that's really something that I think is part of the passion that drove me to the organization. But I want to tell you a story that really brought me into this. So mid last year, as I was approached to consider this opportunity to move to the Committee of 100, we were in the middle of an election, as y'all remember. Governor Landry around that time was looking like he was really running and kind of leading the pack. And a lot of the folks in economic development across the state, who are all many good friends, we wondered what would we want to see in economic development in a new administration. And so y'all have done this in your own organizations. We said, what if we all did internally our own little SWOT analysis of our relationship as regional organizations with the State Economic Development Agency? We went through it. You know, you're looking at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats about how you perceive that state agency and your relationship with them. And the stack of weaknesses was like 3 times as big as the stack of strengths. And all of us had the same acknowledgement of our experience there. And you don't want to necessarily call that out and be a poison pill because they're a close partner of yours when you're doing economic development. And so you have to really have a delicate balance there. But that was really the first thing that kind of struck me when I was being approached about this opportunity, is just how challenging that kind of situation is heading into an administration. The second thing that stood out to me was just how troubling the data is for Louisiana. And I know that slides are a crutch, and I fully admit that I'm going to just embrace that crutch for a few moments of your time today. But it's hard not to visualize this for you so you can kind of see where we are as a state. This is some data we pulled together last summer, and I know it's hard to read, so I'm going to kind of tell you what we see in this chart. So there's a list of all of our southern states and the average amount of non-farm job growth. So how much did those states grow over the 8 years preceding Governor Landry coming into office? The average growth rate in the South is about 9%, just shy of about 9%. Louisiana was the only one of the southern states during that period that lost jobs, so negative 0.6%, roughly flat, right? That was eye-opening. We've all seen these population numbers of what's happening correspondingly in population. But let's play with kind of the counterfactuals here. So if Louisiana had grown at the average growth rate of the South, we would have added about 177,000 jobs. Instead, we lost 12,000 jobs. If we had grown at the 5 fastest growing average states, we would have added about, as you can see, 277,000 jobs. That would have been incredible. If we had grown at the slowest 5 states, it would have been about 100,000 jobs. If we had just grown at the rate of Mississippi, the next slowest growing state, we'd have added about 45,000 jobs. Just gives you a perspective of how angry we should all be at what that looks like. If I flip to the next slide, so I don't want this to be about one gubernatorial administration or one 8-year period. So let's look back. The green line shows you going back to 2011 through May of 2024, the average growth rate in the South of jobs across now the Jindal and the Edwards administration was about 28%, Louisiana 3% across that entire period. If you see that, it actually was sort of trending. You can't pay attention to this, but that orange line is Louisiana. We were kind of keeping up with the average growth rate of the South, although slightly below the average. And then it sort of flatlines all the way through to where we are today, even when you kind of account for that COVID bump. So that's the concern that I think we all have to really absorb. And this was data that we were looking at as I was being asked, do you want to consider moving over to take over the leadership of the Committee of 100? Well, and as I think about the organization, you think about what its purpose should be and how we should kind of reflect upon that. The other big thing that jumped out to us in the data as we were looking at this is this other number that the state really talks a lot more about today, and it's a really esoteric number, but it's called the labor force participation rate. And Louisiana's is 43rd, ranked 43rd in the nation. What does that mean? If you take all of our population and those that are working or looking for work, about 59% of Louisianans fall into that category. That is what ranks us 43rd for that number. If we were average performance of the U.S., so we'd be the 25th state, we'd be at a labor force participation of 62% instead of 59%. Well, that doesn't sound like a big gap. But in the difference of that gap are 142,000 Louisiana lives that would be in the workforce that are not in Louisiana today. And that is something that when we talk about, hey, we have challenges finding people and workers, there's some really massive underpinnings to that affect human citizens in our state that are left behind by the economy. Now, we're ahead of Mississippi and Alabama and Arkansas with that number. That's good. But we're still trailing places like Georgia and Texas and Oklahoma, unfortunately. What does that look like? Because we're not just one big state. We're a bunch of regional economies. What you can see in this chart is that if you look at the labor force participation of every metro in Louisiana, only one, Baton Rouge, is above the U.S. average in terms of its labor force participation. Everybody else is below it. And then on the right-hand side, this goes back to 2010. Only, I think, 4 metro areas have a larger labor force than they did 12 years ago. So this is a challenge that I think is just about every part of our region, every part of our state, really needs to be thinking about what that looks like. The next couple of slides I'm going to narrate those are outcome slides. This is really the activity of what happens in economic development. So when we were doing that experience in economic development last summer about that SWOT analysis of LED, this is data that came out of a legislative auditor's report earlier this year as a lot was being debated about economic development. So what's in the underlying numbers? That black line on the top shows you how many visits LED did to all of you, to existing businesses in Louisiana. That dotted line is their target number that they report to the state they intend to do. The black line is their actual visits to existing businesses to see how they're doing, are they growing. That number declined over the 8 years of the Edwards administration by about 35% over how many business visits happened in the 8 years of the Jindal administration before. And then I'm just kind of comparing periods of time. The other thing is the number of new recorded prospects declined by 50% in that same period. So it just goes to show you kind of how dramatically different. Well, what happens in terms of actual job announcements? They declined by 34% over the last 8 years. Fewer announced projects across all of Louisiana during the 8 years we just went through. And when I look back at those non-farm job numbers, they almost exactly marry up to what we saw in the outcome data that happened. What does that translate to into jobs? Well, this is also in that same report. It was fascinating, and thank God the auditor dug this up because it wasn't something that anybody had really paid attention to their reported data out of LED before. If you see that red dotted line, that's the average number of jobs announced in the 8 years of the Jindal administration on the left, the average dotted line of the non-farm jobs added and announced directly by economic development projects during the last 8 years. They declined by about 44%. So when we talk about like the experience of what economic development looks like, this is very real numbers that show you they have gone down, and the output of Louisiana as a result is not keeping up with our southern peers, I think, in the work that we see. So when I was looking at this and thinking about the opportunity to move to the Committee of 100, you think about where you are in your life and the impact you have and what you're going to leave behind. And I think about this, and I think about how do we then do something different about this? And I think about this organization as something that I hope to be able to do a lot to try to influence the change of these numbers. So what is the Committee of 100 for Economic Development? Where many of our members are here around the room, sitting with you, members from Baton Rouge, from every metro area in Louisiana, who come together as a nonpartisan group of individuals, Republicans and Democrats who want to set aside their partisan differences, as Craig said, to make an impact on the state that they love and to try to find the places of common ground where the influence of heavy hitters can really try to push forward key issues for Louisiana. These are business leaders, but they're also higher education presidents. Almost every four-year education president, public and private, come here to collaborate on these big issues. It's also major foundations and association leaders from across Louisiana who try to work together on those big things. And what are we trying to do? Collectively, we're trying to pursue policy improvements for Louisiana and projects that are going to lead to economic growth for our state. But I think the big thing that I take away, and many of my members have really talked to me about, is to think about the influence of individuals, not of companies. If you think about where I was as a Chamber of Commerce, it's really about companies having participation and engagement. This is really about the members themselves being the strength of the organization. And as the motto of service above self is really that these are members who are and expect to be actively, personally engaged in the work of the Committee of 100 to try to drive the change that we're pursuing. When I came into the organization, we had a quick gathering to say, well, what are our priorities going to be? I want to get some wins on the board for us to be proud of. And these were what our members said we need to be concerned about this year. No shock, across the state. Even in the business community, the concern is everywhere in every part of Louisiana about our economic development performance as a state. A lot of concern about our insurance markets as a drag on business investment and growth in Louisiana, and a substantial concern about the availability of workforce and talent and the need to solve those. What do I observe that these all have in common? The common characteristics are that these are big opportunities for structural changes that we think we can have a clear opportunity for an impact, and these are issues that are deeply connected to Louisiana's economic performance. So I'm going to hit some real quick highlights of some of the things we've been concerned about trying to address with each of these this year. So on insurance issues, and I really credit Tom Clark, who's here as a guest, for his work to do this. So Tim Temple, who just became Commissioner of Insurance last year, was our former chairman, very passionate about insurance issues, and has been actively talking about this among the members of the Committee of 100 for many years. In deciding to run for office and put himself forward, really is focused on making an impact. And this is a great example of we need to mostly just help him be successful as an organization. That's a very difficult environment, as many of y'all have seen. We help support and engage with a lot of the property insurance push that he did this past legislative session, a lot of the pushes around the auto insurance marketplace in Louisiana, and more to come. I think the most important thing I would share with you is we should all see the challenges of our insurance climate as an economic development drag and a problem, and something that we need to see as a priority for addressing if we're looking for big swing for the fences opportunities to drive change for Louisiana. Under issues related to workforce and talent, this is another place where I want to share a little story. So in coming into the job, I'm really hearing workforce and talent issues from every one of our members everywhere in Louisiana of every variety of challenge they're facing. One of the challenges I would summarize as there was a concrete producer and construction company up in Bossier who said, I could hire 10 people tomorrow, but I have no idea where I'm going to find them. I'm just not finding the talent that I need for our company. And I'm telling you, I hear that every door that I walk into, and every one of our members that I've walked into, just the same as I saw when I was here at BRAC. And so we called a meeting together early this year of everyone that we thought in state government, their agency or organization they're part of the delivery system for workforce solutions. We walked in and we said, hey, you're the 5 people. One of you surely is in charge of business workforce solutions. Told them the example and said, which one of you should we direct this company to, or any company to solve for business workforce solutions? And the short answer is all of them are responsible for it, and none of them are responsible for it. We said, well, this is an obvious problem and an obvious place for trying to do an intervention. We called up Senator Rick Edmonds and described from our meeting. He said, well, why don't we file a bill and try to work on a solution to this? That turned into Act 330, which was signed by the governor in June. That we're really proud. This was the first bill that we filed as an organization to really drive that. What does it do? It creates a clear quarterback of a workforce solutions team for Louisiana. For the first time, putting in the statutes of the Workforce Commission that the secretary is responsible for not only working on business workforce shortages and designing a system that does that, but integrating that across Board of Regents, Department of Education, Workforce Commission, LED, Department of Corrections, you name it. They're all part of a solution set, but there has to be a play caller of that team. And that's something that we were really proud to see. There's a lot of work to do to see that implemented. The other big thing that happened, and many of you are either advocates for or involved in education issues, one thing that I've been a big passionate champion for is the importance of internships and apprenticeships for high school kids. If you were to set one theory of action forward, it would be that it would be brilliant and amazing if every high school kid who isn't going to a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree when they finish high school, that student would go, who's going straight into the workforce, hopefully, would have a workplace experience at any and all of your businesses before they graduate high school. However, the systems really aren't set up to incentivize that behavior. And so we were really excited that the new Bessie board came in January and set it into the accountability system by June. This just got done, takes effect next August in 2025, that school districts will get points for when they work with employers to get interns and apprentices at every business in Louisiana. If you go to Europe, if you go to Asia, you're going to see this is a norm, not an exception. But in Louisiana and in most states, it's an exception, not the norm, that high school kids have real workplace experiences in their juniors and senior years. And it's an enormous pipeline of potential future talent, but it's also one of the ways that we potentially think about solutions to what we showed on that labor force participation data is we really have to help nudge that path forward in a much more productive way while kids are in high school. These are two things that got done already this year. The last thing is to talk about LED, where I started. So when we came in, I think the observation we had across economic development and across the Committee of 100 and from the governor's transition team were that LED has been underperforming its peer state economic development agencies. Unfortunately, in my time working with Patrick Martin and others in the Foster administration and Mark Drennan, we have changed economic development strategy every time we elect a new governor. They bring on a new secretary, and it's done slightly differently. They might change out some or many of their team, and then that means we have a whole different way we're executing and presenting ourselves to the national or global market about what we're trying to accomplish to grow our state. We lack a long-range strategic plan in economic development. Really hadn't been one since Vision 2020 was created in the late 90s. And the Department of Economic Development really lacks flexibility to move quickly. What we saw in many other states like Georgia and Virginia and in North Carolina is they operate more at the speed of business and they're not hamstrung by many of the regulations that slow down agencies to move quickly. So what did? We engaged our members, raised some funds, hired national experts. The governor came to us and said, will you help us draft a piece of legislation based on best practice research for the legislative session that's coming in 2024. And so we started in January, right after our DC Mardi Gras event when he asked us to take this on. And we had a piece of legislation filed, sponsored by Senator Beth Mizell on the North Shore, to get that enacted. Senate Bill 494 passed through the process with only a handful of negative votes. It was a negotiation along the way for some of the pieces of it, but got it through to Act 590, signed into law by the governor and really branded by Secretary Susan Bourgeois as positioning Louisiana to win. But in that, really what's behind this bill is 4 things that really put us more in line with what many other states, especially some of the highest performing states, have, which is an economic development agency led by private sector leadership. This board has 9 appointees of the governor, 1 from each 8 metropolitan region of Louisiana, and 1 at large, and then 1 by the Senate President, 1 by the Speaker of the House. And that private sector board is really there to set strategic alignment and goals for where our economy is heading and try to stitch this framework together across the state. Those have term limits that are staggered so that we hopefully have durability of a strategy across administrations, really holding together by the influence of these leaders who are on that board. And we expect that to be named any day now. The second thing is it requires Louisiana to go back to creating a long-range strategic plan with near-term execution performance metrics. That has not existed other than those metrics you saw. No one's really looking at whether we're holding ourselves accountable to those goals and what is expected to be not just an LED plan, but a whole-of-government approach. What's the influence of transportation and DOTD on economic growth, or the Department of Education, or the tax policy of the Department of Revenue? All of these things interconnect to our growth strategy. It removes LED from the Office of Procurement and Technology Services, that challenges we illustrated about flexibility. Most of the states we saw in our benchmark research, they are treated differently than every other state agency because those states realize they have to prioritize a different way to respond and lead as an agency to move quickly. And the last thing is it eliminated some key positions that were written into statute that really shouldn't have been in law, that really hamstrung the secretary to create the right team at the right place to move with what she needed to do. So these are really the major changes that came about. We look a lot more like Georgia and Virginia and Ohio and North Carolina Indiana, I could go on Michigan, Arizona, where you see these private sector leadership really setting a strategic framework for the state to move forward. What is it really I think about the future of the Committee of 100 in this work is that I think we have to realize that we have to look for big opportunities, those, as I outlined that we saw before, where our members see a clear opportunity for impact, where they can work together and drive change, and really hopefully see wins more frequently by our taking a risk and putting forward an action. The Committee of 100 might be thought of, like a lot of organizations that are statewide, as something of a think tank. If any of you ever read or read Wired Magazine, at the front of Wired Magazine, there's always a fun little page that's like, this thing is tired and this thing is wired. So this is my Wired Magazine equivalent, is that the idea of being a think tank that has really important ideas, but really doesn't take the risk to pursue implementation, is the tired notion that I think we have to kind of work forward on, is to see that being a tank that does things, a do tank, or a think and do tank, is really the model that we have to pursue as an organization that takes risks, looks for the opportunity where our members want to put themselves into the work itself, and go and create action. That is where I think we are as an organization, but I also would tell you, if we step back as business community and we think about that data that was such a gut punch, we have to really think about what's the big call to action we all should be thinking about. And if we're sitting here in 2034 or 2024, I think we need to be looking ahead for about 10 years and thinking, what would we love to see different in 2034 that we have to all, as state leaders, whether we're in Monroe, Shreveport, Lake Charles, Alexandria, wherever, to collaborate on for change. I would say we need to push for something like a 10% growth rate over the next decade. When you boil that down year by year, we need to be looking for 1% to 2% growth out of every metro area economy to get there. It gets challenging when you look at some regions are growing and some regions are shrinking. Their non-farm jobs are declining as others are really killing it. And so what does it look like to have a strategy and a business community, not government leaders necessarily, but collaborating with all of us as citizens and leaders in our own communities to drive this change towards something like a 10% growth rate over the next decade? And it's going to take education, infrastructure, tax policy, you name it, wins to make big rocks going to get moved that hold us back from economic growth as the way that we drive that. For us as an organization, we're going to try to look for those 1 to 2 things a year that we can have an influence on to try to have an impact to hopefully drive toward that kind of economic growth that's important for the prosperity for the whole of Louisiana. As a Davidson College grad, as Craig said, and an English major, I'm going to leave you with this poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And I'm going to read a little bit more than just is on the screen, because I think it's just so compelling to this idea where we are. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles, though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Tally-ho. Thank you for having me for lunch. Happy to share if we have time.
Hi, Adam.
Narisha.
So good to see you. It's not a surprise that I have a question. So I love the data that you showed up there, and I think we can all agree that all those are important to it. What I did not see data on, but I'm curious as to, is there any data that talks about the impact of social policies, such as women's rights, LGBTQ, book bans and other issues, on how that impacts other businesses' perceptions of coming to the state of Louisiana, in addition to the stuff that's listed there?
Yeah, no, we don't have that. It's a great question. It's not one that we have measured, but it's a great question and not one that's here. We've really tried to drive kind of an understanding, and we're kind of each month releasing a new economic indicators dashboard where we're trying to drill into different facts of what we can discover about what is kind of present in each of these numbers. We're about to release one on labor force participation. We're going to try to drill even deeper into what's happening. But it's an interesting question. We have not seen any economic data to try to link those kinds of policies to what happens to economic growth. But it'd be interesting if you find it. Yes, ma'am.
I wondered if your jobs data shows the growth of all jobs? Does your jobs data only show a total, or does it break it down where we really know how many are jobs we want? How many are full-time, well-paid with benefits?
So it's great. That's a great question. It does not track benefits data in it, but it does get broken down by almost every industry sector, and you can break it down by wage data by those industry sectors. It's also that you can sort of get a different look at which categories of jobs are growing the largest, and which categories of jobs are shrinking the most. And that's some of the data we've been releasing over the last 6 months to try to unpack inside of that broad number what's overall happening. But it does not necessarily pull out which of those jobs have benefits. There may be data sources that have that. It's not one that we've gotten out. But it does have a lot of information about demand by sector that has kind of grown the fastest, and the wage levels of those data points. And so one of the things that we're going to drill into that we haven't done yet is to start to look at of the tier of jobs, at the lowest paying tiers, what's the rate of growth, for example, at the kind of the rate of increase of the wages that are happening because of labor market shortages. We've seen, and you would assume that supply and demand would mean that that's driving up wage rates across almost every position, lead to income growth. But we've not really unpacked that data. But that would be one way to try to come at what you're asking as well, is to see how this is spreading out in terms of impact for everyone across the state. I think I have over here, and then sorry, go ahead, Ron.
I love the strategic plan idea. I love information and data to base it on. I think this is wonderful. My question is aimed at how do you make that happen? Your change action. You've got the legislature, you've got the governor, you've got your community of 100. So tell me how that all comes together to make change.
Yeah, it's great. So the theory of action is that having substantial number of leaders across Louisiana who have influence, as they care about major priorities, how do we pick up the baton and try to run faster as a team toward a priority or two a year? So our goal is that we're going to try to look for things we can pick up and run with, as you saw some examples of today, to drive that change. Usually that means we have to also engage with leaders across the political spectrum to try to have that be accomplished. And we're trying to drive toward an overarching vision, which is Louisiana needs to drive forward faster rates of overall growth. That usually requires having major relationships through our members and through others that are partners of ours, but maybe not members, that help us build those relationships to try to drive that change. And so that's been how we've been doing it, but it's going to be something that varies by issue, I think.
I'm sorry. Greg?
Yep.
You good? Okay. First of all, Narisha's my friend, so I have to ask a question too. I can't let her get too far ahead of me. But Adam, I just have to say thank you for all the work you did at BRAC. But I did have some questions. I'm a little confused because in my journey as a small business owner, the two most impactful organizations in my experience have been BRAC and the LED. So when I see about like dismantling it, or not dismantling it, but reducing the higher managerial staff or the leaders over there, from my experience, they've been amazing. Have great programs. I've been involved in like 80% of them, and I have great things to say. What I'm confused about is they're an award-winning organization and agency.
Yeah.
Every year they're winning amazing awards. Is this like an LED Fast Start program where we're not going out and finding new businesses, recruiting them into our state?
Yeah.
Where is the confusion or chaos?
Yeah.
Because from my perspective, they've been an amazing resource with great programs and stellar people.
Yeah. So in any organization, you'll find they have moments of excellence and some challenges and weaknesses that they're just not even doing as a practice. So I'll use some examples of this. When we did that SWOT analysis exercise, on the strength side, we absolutely put at the top of the list that they do some of the best in the nation services and programs to engage and support small businesses, emerging businesses across Louisiana exceptionally well. In fact, I would say that if you haven't, and you're a business owner and you're wanting sort of coaching on growth, I just sent this to somebody I was with this weekend to get engaged in a CEO roundtable through LED. They have great programs for that, and that's where they win a lot of their awards, is for their emerging and small business programs. They also, LED Fast Start, you mentioned, is one of the best workforce services programs in the nation. It's ranked second best in the nation for supporting workforce delivery to economic development projects. Where we are weak is a lot of the things that are core bread and butter activities that economic development agencies tend to do. And the example of this was when Secretary took over a few months ago, went in and met with her leadership team, and I hope I'm not telling a story out of school. She asked, how many of you are doing business development to help us find new types of things that might come into Louisiana? And not a hand went up. And I think what we saw in our regional organizations was the same thing. There's really nobody out promoting new investment into Louisiana as aggressively as we see in other states on almost every front. We also don't see aggressively, proactively looking at the target industries that matter to each metro area distinctly. And when those two things compound, that's where I think a lot of that LED data, kind of total outcomes numbers decline. And so while we are very good at certain things, there are some core things that they have to deal with, and that's where I think they're working through trying to change that. The thing that I would say, though, is we need to make sure we get them in a good position. Don't dismantle or harm the things that are working well, continue to improve those, but improve those things where there are substantial weaknesses, and then keep them there through administrations. Does that make sense? Yes.
Hi, Roy.
Yeah,
Roy Haggerty. I'm the Executive Vice President and Provost at LSU. Been here a little over 2 years, came from outside, as you might hear.
Yep.
I was in Oregon prior. And one of the first things one of the things that's been really obvious to me is that it's very apparent that the state of Louisiana, the people, the government, doesn't trust its own agencies. And I see that at LSU. I mean, that we have regulations that are just impossible to imagine in some other places. We don't have freedom to charge our own tuition. We can't carry money forward from one year to the next. We have regulations that restrict activities that we would manage just fine ourselves, but that prevent us from carrying on certain types of activities that would benefit the state of Louisiana. Is there an effort to deregulate some of the the state agencies themselves from the legislature?
So it's a great question. I think there's a lot of appetite for it. There's not a movement in that direction, Roy. I think just in our conversations about LED this last legislative session, there was a lot of acknowledgement that many of these challenges are pretty consistent to other things that legislators care about, and that those bureaucracies do hamstring other functions. Yeah, absolutely. So I think there could be an appetite for it. I have not seen that there's a movement, afoot to try to do that. I think I'm at time. Thank y'all for having me, and it was great to be here.